Welcome to another of our devotional studies from the book of Job, looking at the question of suffering. I'm Greg Bing, pastor of Grace Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm glad that you've decided to join us for this study in God's Word today. In our last study, we saw the response of Eliphaz, one of Job's three friends, to Job's lamentation and distress over his current situation. He reasoned with Job from his experience and from a vision he supposedly received in the night, supposedly from a spirit, maybe from God. In his speech, he implied that Job's sufferings were obviously the result of God's judgment upon him because of some type of sin in his life, a sin which evidently Job was not willing to recognize or admit to. In our study today, Eliphaz is not finished with Job. We see as we continue on in Job chapter 5, we see his speech continues. And he begins with an implication. Look with me in Job chapter 5, verse 1. He makes this statement. He says, "Call out now." He's talking to Job. He says, "Is there anyone who will answer you?" He says, "And to which of the holy ones will you turn?" Job's questioning of why, Eliphaz implies no one's going to answer you. God hasn't answered you. And which of his holy ones, which of the angels are you going to turn to that's going to give you an answer as well? You can't expect the God to respond to this. Now, he says, why not? Well, look at the next verse, verse 2. What he says is this. Eliphaz says, "For wrath kills a foolish man, and envy slays a simple one." Now, the implication here is that he believes Job is a foolish man. Now, foolish in the sense of a man who does not look at God as he should, a man who does not fear God as he should. Now, that Job has been described as a man who does fear God, but he's implying that he's not turning to God here as he should. He's not acknowledging that God's working in this situation, but God is working and judging Job because of some sin, and Job won't admit that. Then in verse 3, he goes back to what he has said earlier in chapter 4. He says, I've experienced, I've observed some things, and from that experience, I know what's happening here. So he says, I have seen the foolish taking root. And that suddenly, he says, I cursed his dwelling place. His sons, it says, are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate, and there's no deliverer. Because the hungry eat up his harvest, taking it even from the thorns, and a snare snatches their substance. Again, he's implying that this is what happens to the foolish, and his reasoning is that that's what Job is. Job's behaving foolishly here. And it talks about three different areas in which the foolish suddenly has a judgment come upon him from God. Number one, it says his dwelling place is cursed. Well, that happened to Job, his household and his possessions. That's what happened to him. Now it says his sons are far from safety. His children are crushed in the gate. Job lost all of his children as a result of judgment. His harvest and his substance are eaten up and snatched away. Job's possessions were all taken away. These are the losses Job suffered in Satan's first attack upon him. Therefore, it implies that Job is certainly one who's not looking to God as he should now. He's not recognizing this is God's work taking these things away from you. So what explains such sudden and complete loss? Why would these things happen? Well, look at verse 6. Eliphaz continues to reason, and he says, his affliction does not come from the dust. It says, nor does trouble spring from the ground. It's almost kind of like the picture of, it's not like a weed that just springs up on its own. You don't have to, sow seeds for weeds. They just come. If you've got a yard in your house or something, you know that. You didn't arrange for weeds to happen. They just did. He says that's the way it is with trouble. That's the way it is with distress in one's life. It doesn't come from that. It has to be sown. It has to be plowed. What he said in chapter 4, verse 8, those who plow iniquity, those who sow trouble, will reap the same. He says affliction doesn't just happen. Look at verse 7. He goes on and it says, Yet man is born to trouble, as the sparks fly upward. It's inevitable. He says it's inevitable that trouble is going to come into our lives, is what he's saying. It's like the sparks flying upward from a fire. It's just something that's going to happen. When he says man is born to trouble, I think the number one, that implies that by birth we're born into this world sinners. Everyone is. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We are by nature sinners. But also we're born into a world that is cursed by sin. And so just living in this world, we're going to feel the effects of sin as well in our lives. Beginning in verse 8 and going down through verse 26, he gives advice. Eliphaz gives his advice. Here's what I would do. Notice verse 8. He says, as for me, he says, I would seek God. And to God I would commit my cause. He's implying that Job hadn't done these things. If I were you, Job, I would seek God in this. Job's really kind of cried out to God and done that. It's just God hasn't answered. I would entrust or commit my cause to Him. In other words, just leave it in His hands. Now, why seek God? Why trust yourself to His cause? For two reasons. Number one, beginning in verse 9 through verse 16, he says, it's because God does great things. Verse 9, He does great things, things that are unsearchable, marvelous things without number. Just thinking about all the things that God does. Verse 10, He gives rain on the earth. He sends water on the fields. Verse 11, He sets on high those who are lowly. He says, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands cannot carry out their plans. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the cunning comes quickly upon them. You know, God does all of these things. He provides what men need as far as their crops and their possessions and taking care of things here on this earth. He raises up those who are lowly. He lifts to safety those who are mourn. That was Job's condition at the present. He was not in safety. He was mourning. He says, God lifts up. He says, He judges wisely. He subverts the cunning and the crafty from their plans. He saves the needy. Verse 15, He saves the needy from the sword, from the mouth of the mighty, and from their hand. And so the poor have hope, and injustice shuts her mouth. He says, just trust God through this, Job. He'll take care of you. He does great things. He does good things. Now, the second thing we see in verses 17 through 26, He corrects and He chastens His children when they sin, when they're in error, when they falter or fall because of sin. Verse 17, Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore do not despise the chastening of the Almighty. Eliphaz reasons, these things have happened to you, that this is God's way of chastening you, of correcting some sin in your life. Again, he's got this same argument over and over again. He says, don't despise that. Don't turn away from that. Learn from it. Accept it. He says, for verse 18, For He bruises. Yes, He does bring chastening. He does bring correction. But He binds up. When He bruises, He binds up. He brings healing. He wounds, but His hands make whole. I think what he's saying is this, that the correcting and chastening that God provides in people's lives and in the lives of His children is needed to enable God to bring people to a place of completeness, of wholeness, of spiritual maturity. So He's going to deliver you. Look at verse 19. He shall deliver you in 6 troubles. Yes, in 7 no evil shall touch you. God will deliver you eventually from all this. He delivers from famine, from war, from the scourge of the tongue, from destruction, from the beasts of the field, the beasts of the earth. And then look at verse 24. He tells Job this. He says, You shall know. What you will eventually experience is this. You shall know that your tent, your dwelling place, is in peace. You shall visit your dwelling, and you'll find nothing amiss. You're going to eventually go back to your house, and everything will be back like it was. You shall also know that your descendants shall be many, and your offspring like the grass of the earth. He says, God's going to give you children. You shall come to the grave at a full age. Yes, you're suffering the painful boils right now, and your health is deteriorating, but you're going to come to the grave at a full age. You're going to live a full life as a sheaf of grain ripens in its season. Just trust God through this. God will take care of you. He'll correct you. He'll chasten you, but He'll bring you through all this. He'll bind your wounds. He'll restore your wholeness if you'll just trust Him in this. Now, these are the things that Job has experienced already. But his words, think about this, probably don't bring a whole lot of comfort, especially the ones that says, your descendants shall be many. Well, that's not going to help him in the loss of all of his children. He lost 10 children. They're not going to be brought back. So this is not very comforting to him to hear these words. And then his conclusion in verse 27. And you can almost hear the smugness in Eliphaz as he makes these statements. He says this, he says, Behold, which means just observe this, notice this, recognize this, Job. Behold, this we have searched out. Everything I've told you, everything I've advised you here, we've searched all this out. We've analyzed this. We've reasoned this through. I've seen this in my experiences. I know that these things are true. He says, and in fact, he says that. It is true. What I have said to you is true. There's no question in his mind that what he said is right. Now, there are a lot of people who believe that certain things are absolutely true that are not. We can't go just because this man says it's true, but he says it very smugly. He says, and we know this. His two friends he believes will support him. He said, Job, you just need to hear it. Hear it and know it for yourself. You need to take notice that our wisdom in this and our advice to you is correct. You follow this and you're going to be okay because we're right about this. Eliphaz speaks and reasons as if the God of the universe is a God who can be figured out. His concept of God, his understanding of God, is a God that's much too small than what he really is. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 29, verse 29, it says, there are secret things that belong to the Lord our God. In other words, things that we'll never know. Eliphaz and the other two friends, and Job for that matter, do not know what took place in Job chapters 1 and 2 in the conversations between God and Satan. And as far as we know in this book, it's never made known to them. Those things are never made known to them. Those were secret things that belong to God and were not made known to them. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9 tells us that God spoke through Isaiah to Israel saying this, my thoughts are not your thoughts. God's thoughts are not like our thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. God doesn't think, God doesn't do things like we do. In fact, it says, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Romans chapter 11, verses 33 to 35, we find these statements from the Apostle Paul. After talking about the sovereignty of God, he says, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Eliphaz speaks as if he knows God and knows how God works always. He doesn't. In fact, no one does. In our next study, we hope they'll join us as we look at Job and his response to Eliphaz's speech and his advice as we continue on these studies in Job chapter 6.